There are seasons in life where you feel the quiet pull to be somewhere else. Not necessarily in a dramatic, pack up your life kind of way, more like a persistent ache, an inner murmur that says, not this, or not here, or maybe just not anymore. I've been sitting with that feeling myself lately. There's been a kind of burnout, a creeping discontent, not just from work or routine, but something harder to name. A sense that the environment no longer fits, that the life I'm living isn't wrong, but no longer fully mine. A vision has been forming, gently, persistently, a different setting, slower pace, more space to think and create. A place with all four seasons, a lot of quiet, maybe even a cabin in the woods, on a lake, with a desk by a window, and the kind of light that makes you want to write. It visits me often, not only when I'm overwhelmed or tired, but in moments of stillness too. It feels less like a fantasy and more like a blueprint for peace. And yet I haven't moved. I haven't even looked. Maybe I'm not ready, not mentally, not physically. The body stays even when the mind begins to imagine another way. And so I find myself in a strange in-between, longing for something I can't yet pursue, but unable to ignore. That's what we're exploring in today's episode, the deeply human experience of anywhere but here. Where does that feeling come from? Is it a true calling? A quiet rebellion against misalignment? Or is it simply a form of psychological escape? A way to explain an internal ache by projecting it onto a distant landscape. We'll talk about longing, escapism, paralysis, and the powerful myth that once we arrive somewhere else, everything will fall into place. And we'll ask, what if the destination we're dreaming of doesn't exist out there, but in how we choose to live right here?
Hello and welcome to The Psychology of Us with Professor R.J. Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. R.J. Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
There's something hauntingly universal about the phrase, anywhere but here. It carries no specific coordinates, no clear direction. Only the deep sense that where we are isn't right. It's an emotional restlessness, not always loud, but steady. A background hum in the psyche. And often, we don't even notice it's been there until it builds into tension we can't ignore. Psychologically, this kind of longing is often a symptom of misalignment. Something inside us knows we've outgrown our current situation, but we haven't yet figured out how to say it out loud or what to do about it. Maybe our job has become more performative than purposeful. Maybe our surroundings, once invigorating, now feel oppressive or dull. Maybe the way we've been living was once in service of survival, but now feels like we're living someone else's script. So the mind starts to drift. It begins imagining other lives, other landscapes. Excuse me. Not always in vivid detail, though. Sometimes it's just the emotional temperature of a different life. Colder air, quieter mornings, fewer expectations. Or maybe it's not the external world at all. Maybe it's simply about the ability to feel more like ourselves, to feel something we haven't felt in a long time. Possibility. This ache becomes a psychological phenomenon worth exploring, not just because it's uncomfortable, but because it reveals something about how we relate to reality. Most of us are not trained to sit with discontent. We're taught to fix, to flee, or to fantasize. So we start to reframe our emotional discomfort as logistical problems. Maybe I just need to move. Maybe I need a new job. Maybe I need to start over. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes we mistake the symptom for the solution. What we're really saying with anywhere but here is, I want to feel different than I do now. And that's important to hear, not to dismiss it, but to understand it. Because the mind doesn't fabricate these feelings without reason. They are signals. They are telling us that some part of our current life is too tight, too dry, too far from what feels nourishing or real. And when we don't listen, the signal gets louder. Sometimes as daydreaming, sometimes as withdrawal, sometimes as resentment. So for now, I want to gently invite you to reflect. When you feel the urge to be somewhere else, what are you truly trying to escape? What are you hoping to find on the other side? And just as importantly, what do you fear might follow you there? Because here's the truth, most of us learn only after we move. We don't just leave our problems behind. We take ourselves with us. And yet, the ache still speaks. So let's keep listening to it, carefully, curiously, and without rushing to answer. Now let's get into burnout, fantasy, and the need to feel something different. Burnout does something strange to the mind. It flattens everything. Even the parts of life that once felt meaningful start to lose their color. And when that flattening sets in, the imagination gets busy. It begins to reach for anything that feels alive, different, unburdened. That's often where the fantasy begins. You imagine waking up somewhere else, a town where no one expects anything of you, a home where your energy isn't constantly drained, a job, maybe not even a job, but a vocation, something that feels like it's yours. You picture a quiet space, maybe a window, maybe a dog nearby, maybe coffee and sunlight and time to write or build or think. It's vivid. It feels clean. And best of all, it's not this. Psychologically, fantasy is a coping mechanism. In many ways, it's a beautiful one. When we're too exhausted to plan, too stuck to act, the mind does what it can. It gives us an emotional placeholder. It gives us a reason to keep going, something to look toward, a place where we imagine we can finally rest or breathe. But fantasy also comes with risk. It can become addictive because, unlike the real world, fantasy doesn't talk back. It doesn't require budgeting or relocation logistics or stamina or packing. It doesn't confront you with the parts of yourself you've been trying to avoid. Fantasy is perfect because it's untouched. It lives outside the laws of entropy and conflict. It soothes, not by offering a path, but by erasing the need for one. That's when the longing becomes blurred. What started as quiet truth, a sign that your current life is out of sync, can turn into a loop of imagined escape. And the longer that loop plays without action or reflection, the harder it is to tell whether the desire is genuine or just something that feels good to imagine. And that creates paralysis. You start to feel like a person suspended between two lives, the one you're living, which feels unsustainable, and the one you imagine, which feels unreachable. And you begin to wonder, if the vision were real, wouldn't I have moved by now? Wouldn't something in me be pulling me into action? But burnout distorts motivation, you see. It's hard to move toward peace when you're barely keeping up with the demands of the day. It's hard to pursue change when you don't feel strong enough to survive the transition. So the fantasy remains seductive, silent, increasingly more sacred. This is why the emotional experience of anywhere but here can't be judged only by whether or not you're acting on it. Sometimes the longing is real, but the conditions for movement just don't exist yet. And the longer that tension remains, the more we have to ask, what is the fantasy doing for me? What is it protecting me from? And how do I keep it from becoming a substitute for my actual life? The point is not to banish the vision. It's to become more conscious of how it operates. When it's nourishment and when it's avoidance. When it's a map and when it's a mirage. Now let's take a look at the myth of arrival. There's a moment, if we're honest, in every anywhere but here fantasy when we quietly tell ourselves, once I get there, everything will be better. We don't say that out loud. We might not even consciously believe it, but deep down, we start to attach healing to a destination. We start to think that peace lives elsewhere, that clarity lives after the move, that once we change our surroundings, we'll become the version of ourselves we've been waiting to meet. This is what I call the myth of arrival. It's a powerful illusion that there's a fixed point in the future where we will finally feel settled, creative, present, healthy, joyful, disciplined, whole. And this belief isn't just about relocation. It can show up in relationships, careers, even identities. Once I get the new job, once I find the right person, once I leave this city, then I'll finally be myself. But psychology tells a different story. Because wherever we go, we bring the nervous system we've been living with. We bring the habits of self-doubt, the fatigue, the emotional patterns we've developed over time. We bring the same inner dialogue, the same inner resistance, the same all-caught-upness. If those things are unresolved, they do not disappear with the change in setting, they adapt. Now, this doesn't mean change is pointless. It means change is not the cure. At best, it's a container. It might make things more spacious, more manageable, but it cannot create the internal shifts we often project onto it. So we have to ask ourselves the hard questions. What do I think will happen when I get there? What problem do I believe will be solved? What version of myself do I believe will finally appear? And why isn't that version allowed to exist now? You see, my friends, often the fantasy of arrival is really a wish to be relieved of the burden of healing, to bypass the hard work of showing up differently within our current lives. We want the change or the setting to change us. But what actually changes us is the decision to stop outsourcing our peace. This is why so many people move across the country, change everything, and still feel the same old ache. Because they've changed their address, not their relationship to themselves. And in that new place, the silence can be even louder. So this is not about staying where you are. And it's not about telling yourself to settle. It's about releasing the fantasy that there is some magical there that will fix what here has revealed. Because the truth is, you can leave, you can go, you can start over. But if you do, let it be from a place of conscious movement, not quiet desperation. Let it be an act of alignment, not escape. So at this point in the journey, the question sharpens, is this just a longing or is it alignment trying to speak? Because not all longing is the same. Some forms of longing emerge from pain. We're desperate to feel different, so we latch on to any image that promises relief. But then other longings come from truth. They come from the part of us that has quietly outgrown the current version of our lives and is ready to live more honestly, more fully, more freely. Psychologically, we can sense the difference by how the longing behaves. Longing born of escapism is loud, impatient, full of urgency. It shows up mostly when we're overwhelmed or triggered. It demands change, but rarely offers clarity. It's a form of emotional projection, our pain wearing the mask of a plan. But longing born of alignment is calmer, more consistent. It doesn't pressure. It doesn't spike and crash. It lingers. It's there when you wake up, not just when you're stressed. It's not trying to save you. It's trying to be you. The tricky part is that both longings, longing born of alignment and longing born of escapism, both longings can exist at once. You can genuinely want to change your life and still be using that desire to avoid something unresolved. That's not a contradiction. It's a human experience. So how do you know if it's real? One sign, one sign is that the vision keeps showing up even when life is good, even when you're rested, connected, not in crisis. If the desire is still there when you're not trying to flee something, that's often alignment. Another sign is that the idea of moving forward toward it, even slowly, brings relief, not escape, not avoidance, just a quiet yes, not a surge of adrenaline, but a steady feeling of rightness. And here's something else to consider. If the dream feels heavy, like it demands perfection or performance, it's likely not coming from your soul. Real alignment doesn't ask you to be someone else. It allows you to return to yourself. And this is where many of us get stuck. People think, if this desire were real, I'd be moving by now. But readiness is more than desire. It's about capacity, energy, timing, support. And even if one of those things is missing, we stall. Not because the dream isn't real, but because the system isn't ready. So don't confuse stillness with falsehood. Don't assume your inability to act right now means the vision is invalid. It might simply mean you are still integrating, still preparing, still clearing space in your life for the next version of yourself to take root. And that's not failure, my friends. That's not failure. That's respect. Because alignment isn't rushed. It doesn't operate on panic. It waits for when the body, the mind, and the spirit are all ready to say yes. Now, what happens when here and there start to overlap? What happens when we stop thinking of there as a location and start thinking of it as a way of being? This is where deeper shifts begin. So much of the anywhere but here impulse is about escape. Escape from noise, escape from burnout, disconnection, creative drought. But once we've honored the longing, questioned it, and listened to its complexity, we're faced with a more empowering possibility. Maybe the life I think exists somewhere else actually begins in how I live here today. This is not a platitude. It's a psychological invitation. What if the calm you associate with the lake can be accessed through how you structure your day? What if the space you imagine finding in that distant cabin could begin with the way you protect your mornings or create sacred pauses in your week? What if the creativity you hope to unlock somewhere else can be coaxed out now, not with pressure, but with intention? You don't have to abandon the dream, but you also don't have to exile it to some faraway future. When you bring elements of your imagined life into the present, even in small ways, you begin to dissolve the myth that your peace lives elsewhere. This is a process I call psychological arrival. It doesn't mean you don't move eventually. It doesn't mean you never change your job or your surroundings, but it means you stop waiting for the external shift to rescue you. You begin to build conditions for peace within the structure of what is. Now, this can be deeply confronting because it removes the fantasy's clean borders. It forces you to ask, am I willing to take responsibility for creating the life I want, even here, even now, even imperfectly? And if the answer is yes, something begins to change. Not necessarily the geography, but the atmosphere, the quality of attention, the way you relate to time and purpose and energy, the way you start to act not as a person trapped in the wrong life, but as someone returning deliberately to who they were meant to be. Sometimes the cabin on the lake is real. Sometimes the move does need to happen. But when it does, it no longer feels like escape. It feels like alignment catching up with itself. Like the internal life and the external life are finally embracing, finally shaking hands. And even if the move never happens, even if you never leave, the longing will have done its work because it will have brought you closer to yourself, closer to what you value, closer to your truth. And in that sense, you will have already arrived. And now, as I bring this episode to a close, I want to discuss the slow unfreezing of the self. You see, we so often think of movement as momentum, fast, decisive, visible, loud. But some of the most important movement in our lives happens quietly, even invisibly. It happens in the moments when we stop dismissing the longing, when we stop demanding certainty before we listen, when we allow ourselves to want what we want without apology, but also without illusion. If you've been feeling the pull to be somewhere else, somewhere slower or quieter, more yours, or even the opposite of those, I want you to know that you're not alone. That ache is not something to be ashamed of. And it's not something to act prematurely on either. It's something to honor, to explore, to question, and to slowly integrate. Because, my friends, sometimes the longing is your truth. And sometimes it's your fatigue. And oftentimes it's both. But the antidote to fantasy isn't cynicism. It's presence. It's asking, what can I access now, here, in this life, that reflects what I've been imagining elsewhere? And then, what do I need to release, repair, or reclaim so that my next step, whenever it comes, is made in alignment and not in escape? The self doesn't bloom on command. It unfolds when it's ready. And readiness often begins with awareness, with the soft, steady decision to stop running and start listening. So wherever you are right now, mentally, emotionally, geographically, take a breath. Not the kind you force, but the kind that arises when you remember that you are allowed to evolve, even slowly, even while standing still. Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Psychology of Us. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember, you're already closer than you think.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor R.J. Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.